Salve a tutti, questa è una presentazione su The Art of Darkness.
Hey there! Today we're going to talk about The Heart of Darkness, a very important book with very important themes.
Però, prima di parlarvi di The Art of Darkness,
But before we talk about The Heart of Darkness, we should talk about the author, Joseph Conrad, about his life and what led him to write a book like this.
e quindi niente.
Joseph Conrad was born in 1857 from a Polish family. His father was a translator and a political activist. He urged little Joseph to read many Polish and French books, which he did. The Conrad family encountered many difficulties, starting from Apollo, the father, getting arrested, and followed by the mother's death by tuberculosis. 4 years later, Apollo dies, leaving 11-year-old Joseph an orphan. Joseph was then taken by his uncle, who was now in charge of his education. He assigned his nephew a private teacher, with whom Joseph traveled a lot and learned even more. In his travels, Joseph found his passion, life by the sea, which is why, when the Russians tried to enlist him in the army, Joseph's uncle sent him away as a sailor to France. From France, Joseph sailed to the Caribbean, South America, and Constantinople, living the life of a seaman and an alleged arms dealer. Some say that Conrad played a part in some conspiracies, and that he helped some Central American states and the Carlists in Spain with the revolution. His uncle gave him monthly checks, but Conrad spent his money unwisely.
After his trip to Constantinople, Conrad went to England, where he could enlist in the navy. In his voyages, Joseph was able to learn the English language and literature. In the navy, Joseph Conrad had many adventures. He sailed to Southeast Asia, passing through India, Thailand, Singapore, and New Guinea. He sailed through Europe and Africa, more specifically in Congo. In his voyages, he had plenty of stories which he then wrote about in English, his third language that he still mastered. In this period, Conrad was stranded on a raft for 12 hours. He witnessed all the horrors that humankind was capable of, and all these traumatic events gave Joseph a distorted view of evil, something he carried on through his later years. After all of his journeys across the world, Conrad decided to rest, and he wrote many books. And so, after 16 years of service to the British Navy, Conrad declined the British knighthood and died an established man of the sea, writer and political conspirator.
So you can't really say that Conrad's life was boring at all. On the contrary, he lived a crazy life. He went in so many places, met so many different people, and most importantly, he had so many crazy experiences, good or bad. And so, for The Heart of Darkness, he couldn't but write about one of his own voyages. A voyage deep into the forests of the Congo, through the Congo River, and into the heart of darkness, Africa.
5 men are waiting for low tide so they can cross the River Thames. Among these men we have the narrator and Christopher Marlowe, a very experienced man of the sea. As they are waiting, Marlowe starts telling a story about his trip to Africa. Since a young age, he had been very interested in traveling around the world and discovering new things. For this reason, he went into the ivory industry, and soon he was sent to an ivory extraction base deep in the forest of the Congo.
And so they set sail. As he arrived at the company base, he saw the disparity between the colonizers and the natives. Marlowe saw this type of inequality often, but he describes it as so. Black shapes crouched, lay, sat between the trees, leaning against the trunks, clinging to the earth, half coming out, half effaced within the dim light, in all the attitudes of pain, abandonment, and despair. Another mine on the cliff went off, followed by a slight shudder of the soil under my feet. The work was going on, the work. And this was the place where some of the helpers had withdrawn to die.
Dunque, quello che abbiamo
And so, it's clear by reading the first part of the book that there are many problems caused by colonization. As a matter of fact, there are clearly many inequalities and differences between the lives of the colonizers and colonized. The latter aren't even treated as humans. But hold on, you'll see that this is just the tip of the iceberg.
la punta dell'iceberg.
As Marlowe arrived at the base, his boss told him what was going on. A worker had gone rogue. His name is Kurtz. Kurtz was a German extractor that made a lot of money for the company. One day he decided to keep all of the ivory extracted so that he could have power among the natives. And so he made a camp in the middle of the African forest. Now Marlowe's job is to bring back Kurtz, and the journey there is very dangerous because there are many attacks on the company's boats. Just the day before, an exploratory team had been found dead.
Marlowe decides to hire along with his crew and some other Europeans a group of natives, the so-called pilgrims. These people are cannibals and considered very dangerous. Even though he hired dangerous people, he couldn't avoid an attack. Not long after stopping were they suddenly attacked by another group of pilgrims.
And so Marlowe had to hire the pilgrims. These pilgrims are just native Africans who are just very, very dangerous. They're cannibals and they are called criminals. As you can see, they aren't really thought as people. As a matter of fact, there isn't even a personal relationship between the original members of the crew and the newly hired pilgrims. And even though Marlowe didn't really consider them as men, he needed the help, and so he still hired them.
After surviving that ferocious attack from the pilgrims, Marlowe arrives at Kurtz's base. Here he finds a collaborator, a Russian, who explains that Kurtz isn't dead, but still very ill. He then explains what Kurtz has done and where Marlowe can find him. Lastly, he gives him some papers, where are all written reports of his activity in the colonies, signed with one last phrase: exterminate all the natives.
Marlowe finally reaches Kurtz's camp in the middle of the forest. Here he finds that Kurtz has surrounded his camp by heads on stakes, covered in blood, to scare away anyone who tries to question him. All of the local natives are subjugated, and they were convinced that Kurtz was superior because of his character, his determination, the way he talked, and because of his ivory. For these reasons, they treat him as a god. Even though he is ill, the natives haven't embraced him. They seem to care about his health and try to help him, but as we heard, Kurtz hates the natives. And even when they're trying to help him, he still treats them as inferior.
Quindi, Marlowe arriva all'accampamento di Kurtz.
And so, as Marlowe approaches Kurtz's camp, he finds a man swallowed by greed. His big quantities of ivory made him like a god amongst the natives. Kurtz loves this power, and this is why he never came back.
Però
But even though Kurtz thinks that he is better than anyone else, he as every man gets sick. And so, as Marlowe finds him lying in bed, he is reminded that he is just as human as the native he enslaved.
Che ci invita a fare il nostro corpo.
So, Conrad forces us to think about the fact that the colonizer, who thought they were bringing civility, education, and better ethics to the natives, are no better than pilgrims themselves. Too much power made Kurt so much worse than the people he enslaved, and this is something that happened too often. To this day, there are similar episodes happening all around the world, and people still haven't learned that everyone is equal. And they do things that go against their own morals.
Vanno contro alla loro stessa etica.
Marlowe has arrived at Kurtz's house. He drags him to his boat. His job is almost done. Kurtz is just a shell of a man. Marlowe starts his steamer, and so his journey back to company base begins. Kurtz's condition only worsens. Other people on the ship are getting sick as well. Marlowe is also sick, but pushes through and manages to survive. Kurtz isn't so lucky, and in his final moments, is only able to mumble, "Horror, horror," while handing some papers and a photo of a woman to our protagonist.
Marlowe reaches company base, explains what happened, and is in some way happy that his job is done. The first thing he does after all these events is go back to England and look for the woman that was in Kurtz's photo. After finding her, he tells her that Kurtz was a normal man, a good man even, and that he thought of her in his last moments. Marlowe's life goes back to normal and he acts like nothing really happened, as he said to the woman.
E quindi Marlowe e il narratore sono tornati a casa.
And so Marlowe finally comes back to England. The first thing he does is look for the mysterious woman that was in the picture that Kurtz gave him. And he talks to her about Kurtz, but he only says good things about him. He tells her that he loved her and that he thought about her in his last moments, not even mentioning all the evil acts he did there in Africa. This is something that happens very often. Colonialists forget, or try to forget, all the horrors they make in the colonies and try to live their normal lives at home. But they should really take responsibility, because what they do is something to other humans just like themselves, and they shouldn't forget that. And we shouldn't forget that, because unfortunately, because we live off of the work of these people that are exploited. So it's up to us to remedy all of the wrong choices that our ancestors made in the past, in the colonies.